One of my earliest memories is of sitting on the basement floor of my early childhood home, watching my mother run the laundry through. That one's electric, but she had a hand crank wringer on the top of our washing machine. Such a machine would have seemed very primitive to anyone that was born just 10 years later. But in the mid-1950s, it was a step up from the scrub board and the wash pan that had been used before that was invented. My parents did their homework by the light of oil lanterns. They commuted to school either on foot or on horseback. Their homes were heated with wood, and a good deal of farm life for both of them still involved milking cows by hand, and when they had to work the fields, they harnessed a mule. The innovations of modernity held the promise of a much easier life. Labor-saving inventions allow you to cook without having to chop wood first, to vacuum a rug inside the house instead of dragging it outside and throwing it over the clothesline and beating it with a bat. I remember our first washing machine and dryer. I remember our first dishwasher. I remember our first microwave oven, and gleefully remember our first air conditioner. Life for middle-class Americans went through an evolution in the 60s and 70s that took a lot of time-consuming drudgery out of life, at the same time making our homes much more comfortable and reasonably safer. Now, I was in grad school when computers became a part of a private citizen's life. It was an amazing day for me when I no longer had to type my many papers with a carbon paper stuck between two sheets of paper with a bottle of whiteout correction fluid or correction tape at the ready. My first computer saved me 15 to 20 hours a week of tedious labor. But labor saving can mean different things. It can mean that our daily lives are less labor intensive and more comfortable, and it can also mean that many occupations become irrelevant. 20 years ago, I had 3 secretaries managing the record-keeping, financing, and communications in the church where I was the pastor. 10 years ago, we were down to 2 and trying to find ways to keep them busy. During the course of the life of this church, we've never had a secretary because the internet and computer programs have made communication and record keeping so much more simple that I probably don't spend a day a week doing what I used to have 3 full-time staff members doing. Automation and innovation are taking jobs out of the economy, jobs that used to be just assumed fixtures in society. Christmas shopping, for example, on the internet was a novelty 10 years ago, but many of you may not have seen the inside of our Battlefield Mall in Springfield for many years. Even when you go to the grocery store, you are more and more likely to be forced to use a self-checkout register, and at least for those of us that shop in box stores, you have an app on your phone, and you don't even have to stop at the automated self-checkout teller. You just do it on your telephone and charge it to your credit card, and you walk out of the store. The harnessing of electricity, the invention of modern automobiles and airplanes changed the world dramatically. But then came automation in manufacturing. Then the whole world of computers and the internet and the promises of artificial intelligence. These have all brought adjustments in employment and have shifted economic resources and largely shifted them from the hands of the middle class into the hands of the super wealthy. President Trump has vowed to bring back coal mining jobs, which necessarily means 2 things. The first is that Donald Trump has never been in a coal mine and doesn't have the slightest idea what he's talking about. The second is that he has no idea how coal is mined now. It's not simply that coal is being replaced by other cleaner and cheaper energy sources, but what coal is being mined by powerful robots that can do the work of hundreds of human coal miners. Those jobs are gone, and they are not coming back. And frankly, I grew up in coal mining country. I can assure you, no one's going to miss them. There is no one who worked in a mine who hoped that their son or daughter would have to work in the mine. The problem is that no good-paying union jobs have come along to take their place. There are now no unions in the coal fields in Kentucky. Robots don't unionize. They don't demand salary increases or health insurance. Artificial intelligence now promises and threatens a fourth wave of major changes, changes that could usher in a time of great human leisure. We could cut the human work week back to 10 or 12 hours a week and live very comfortably if we distribute resources appropriately. But it could also force more and more people into unemployment and abject poverty. What is certainly true is that we have a lot more people in the labor force than we actually need to provide food, shelter, and services to our population. At the time of the Civil War in America, there were only about 30 million people who lived in the United States, as opposed to our more like 350 million now. Still, the agricultural South was dependent upon captured slave labor to be able to feed their population. We now have more than 10 times as many people in the United States, but we have about a third as many working in agriculture. As the population of America has grown by hundreds of millions of people, there are now fewer people living in rural Missouri than there was at the time of the Civil War, because small family farms basically don't exist anymore, unless it's, a gentleman's farm or recreational farm. Science fiction writers tend to be the prophets of the future, and they tend to see a future that goes in one of two directions. Gene Roddenberry, who envisioned Star Trek, conceived of a world in which there was no currency. And that was one of the things he insisted on in all of his episodes, is that no one was going to get paid for anything. Everyone was given the resources that they needed. Everyone had everything that they needed, and the concept of personal wealth disappeared from the Star Wars episodes. But as we saw in recent Hunger Games series, futurists much more often envision a very bleak future. In fact, you almost never hear the word dystopian used in any conversation except a description of a science fiction futurist movie that's describing a dystopian future filled with violence, poverty, hunger, and government oppression. Innovation can give us a future in which the human mind is set free from the mundane tasks of mere survival, so that we can explore space, we can create art, music, literature, we can turn our minds to creativity and imagination. But it could also give us a future in which human beings are typically more trouble than they're worth, and those few who are wealthy can do everything they can to defend their wealth and comfort against the hordes of the unwashed poor until we all die off. I don't often get to agree with our Catholic Pope, and I kind of hate that when it comes up, we're agreeing on talk about poop. And for our podcast listeners, we're looking at an image of the pontiff with a quote, "Unbridled capitalism is the dung of the devil." In defense of the Pope's honor, he was technically quoting a phrase coined by the 4th century Greek bishop Basil of Caesarea. But the point is that an economy that is based solely upon greed is inherently evil, and the results of it will carry the stench of hellish sewage. Animal Farm, George Orwell's 1945 novel, illustrated the fears Americans shared about the spread of socialism and communism in the early 20th century. This very imaginative story showed how a revolution that begins with good intentions becomes little more than a regime change, exchanging one kind of exploitative dictatorship for just a new set of dictators. If there is a moral to the story of Animal Farm, it is saying to workers, be satisfied with your lot in life, because if you organize, unionize, and rebel, everything will end up being worse for you than it was before. That mentality has reigned supreme in both major political parties in the United States for almost a century. Only the desperation of the Great Depression and the threat of crushing poverty from World War II allowed for the creation of a social safety net of any sort in America. But even when it was being constructed, Franklin Roosevelt was often portrayed as being dangerously tilted towards socialism. By the 1960s, when President Johnson tried to follow the lead of the rest of the civilized world in creating a national health care program, he was beaten back to a point of compromise, creating first Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the desperately poor. But insurance companies were unwilling to allow for national health care coverage because there was a profit to be exacted from those that had the money to pay premiums, so that being sick is not seen as a problem to be solved. It is an opportunity to make a profit. The argument in Animal Farm is that socialism fails on two fronts. The first is that the powerful will always seek to claim the majority of the goods for themselves, but the second, portrayed in the novel and true, what you would have to call typecasting or stereotyping, they use a cat, is that the lazy will always find a way to scam the system so that they will eat and be housed without providing any labor. When was the last time you saw your cat get up and go to work, after all? And any of us who have experience working with the poor know that you can find a lot of very sad examples of people who will do just that. They will try to scam the system. When I was first taking training in clinical counseling, the Bible of psychology, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, contained a diagnosis called entitlement disorder, which has now just been made an aspect of the narcissistic personality disorder. But I think that most of us have seen an entitlement disorder in action. We sometimes call them teenagers, but there is a personality type that if it is possible to live without working, they will do it. What is sad is that this popular prejudice against the poor and unproductive blinds people to the real scammers who are managing to manipulate this marriage of democracy to unbridled capitalism so that they can write themselves blank checks in the form of subsidies being given to industries that are already wildly profitable. The oil industry gets subsidies. Like what we give them at the gas pump isn't enough. They are making billions of dollars, but they have so much power that they get subsidies for themselves. The pharmaceutical industry is managing the way in which their profits are protected so that their copyright values for their medications that they invent are carried on much longer than they need to be. They make all of their money back and then just continue to make money as if they were printing it themselves. I never get tired of reminding you that there are 3 lobbyists on Capitol Hill for every elected official that work solely for the pharmaceutical company, making certain that we continue to pay them because we are sick. One of President Trump's recent screeds has been advocating for the execution of drug dealers who are causing the tragically lethal opioid crisis in America. And you can't overstate the problem. More than 60,000 deaths last year from opioid overdoses. But I would like to ask President Trump which pharmaceutical CEO he wants to execute first.
Amen, brother.
I'm preaching. There can be no denying that the rewards of capitalism can and do inspire invention and hard work and personal responsibility. But without the balance of regulation that ensures that the rapid evolution of artificial intelligence, robotic labor-saving innovation, and technological advances redound to a better life for everyone, the profit motive will dismiss the value of human life in favor of the value of money. Examples abound, but the moral failure of capitalism can be seen nowhere more clearly than in the American gun manufacturing industry.
Amen.
Folks, during this century, terrorists have killed fewer than 4,000 Americans, counting the 9/11 attack in which more than 3,000 were killed. And yet the fear of terrorists has spawned an exponential government growth in spending in homeland security to keep us safe from the threat of terrorism. However, in this century, just the last 18 years, more than 500,000, something like 650,000 Americans have been killed by domestic gun owners. You are more than 200 times more likely to be killed by someone you know that owns a gun than you are by a terrorist. And yet we don't spend a dime protecting ourselves against this domestic bloodbath because the gun industry is controlling legislation to protect their profits. Since the tragic shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida last month, a student-led protest has arisen in which teenagers are telling us that we have failed them. And you know why they're telling us that? Because we have failed them. We have absolutely failed to sensibly curb the murder rate in our country because we have allowed the profit motive of the gun industry to trump the value of human life, allowing more than 30,000 people to be killed every year for nothing but profit. We have allowed the most morally depraved, the most psycho elements of our society to insist that their right to own weapons is more important than the lives of our school children, our families, and our friends. It's worth saying again, unbridled capitalism is the dung of the devil. It will destroy our nation. The difference between the two visions of our future, either a new world of human comfort and fulfillment like the Jetsons, or a dire and violent world filled with hunger and ignorance, rests in our willingness to make morality more important than profits. Capitalism can be harnessed to create a better future, but left without regulation, without a moral compass, it turns us into the raw material of the bottom line. Unbridled capitalism, the ceaseless and incessant greed of it, has ruined our democracy. It is driving the destruction of our environment. It has driven our prison system into a concentration camp that holds more than 2 million Americans hostage to profits. It has impoverished our schools. It has caused a rationing of health care, and it has flooded our streets with guns. Now, we can stop this. We can change the course of history if we want to badly enough. But we have been beaten into submission, beaten into believing that unions and shared distribution of wealth is somehow inherently evil, so that we have protected the rights of the minority to have untold riches, while most of humanity is afraid about where they're going to get their next meal. We need to offer a universal basic income to everyone.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you that there will be people who will play the role of the cat. That once they get a guaranteed basic income, they will not, as my dad liked to say, hit a lick at a snake ever again. But folks, let me tell you this, that's their problem. That's not your problem. We have more than enough for everyone to have a guaranteed basic income, And that doesn't take any skin off your nose. We need to have universal health care, and we need to make sure that state colleges and universities, we need to make sure that higher education is tuition free. Just like we made public schools tuition free a century ago, no longer is a high school degree going to buy you a place in the economy. A college education is now just as important as a high school education was 50 years ago, and there is absolutely no reason for us to make it more and more difficult for the children of the poor to make it into college. And we need to change our housing codes the way Germany has done, so that you can't build a new house if you can't put solar panels on it. We have to change our construction codes so that we have sustainable building, and we build with a mind towards how we're going to power that place. We need to leave our coal and our oil in the ground and harvest the energy of the wind, the waves, and sunlight, just so that future generations can breathe and eat in this world. And we need to get money out of government so that the NRA can be relegated to the pages of history. And I believe that they have a special place in history right beside ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Nazis. None of this is beyond our grasp. In fact, all of it is a part of the growing social conscience of Western Europe. They're no better than us. We can do everything that they're doing. I hate it when I hear these things as being described as being crazy or unattainable when it's being done on the other side of the Atlantic regularly. We can do the same things. There will be several players needed in the infusion of conscience into our capitalism. It will take political leadership, which means we've got to elect the right kind of politicians. It will take education. People have to read past Animal Farm. You have to know more about how capitalism and the economy actually works. And it will take the networking of people of conscience in all walks of life. Now, I know that our future as a small progressive church in red state Missouri, that our existence seems fragile and uncertain. But there has never been a time in America that needed progressive communities of faith more than America needs us right now. The world needs for us to be courageous, prophetic, loud, annoying, irritating, and defiant, because you cannot stand idly by and expect the world that we want to come into existence. Only your passionate involvement can keep our country from going off the rails. But together, we have lots of reasons for hope.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.